Michael Harmon had never believed in ghosts. 20 years as a contractor had taught him that most house noises had rational explanations: old pipes, settling foundations, expanding wood. Each time a client nervously mentioned a strange sound in the night, he'd find the culprit: a loose floorboard, a faulty radiator, a family of raccoons in the attic. The world made sense to Michael. It operated according to rules of physics, rules of construction, rules he could understand and master. So when he won the bid to renovate the abandoned Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital, he wasn't concerned by the stories. Every old building had them. The locals in Millfield whispered about screams in the night, about patients who went in but never came out, about doctors who'd lost their medical licenses for unspeakable experiments. Standard fare for a century-old asylum, Michael thought. "You sure about this job, Mike?" his assistant Jake had asked when he'd announced the project. "That place has a reputation," Michael had laughed, "for being the biggest payday we've had in years." "Yeah, the development company is paying triple our usual rate. They want to convert it into luxury apartments." "To luxury apartments in an old nut house. Who'd want to live there?" "Rich people with more money than sense," Michael had replied. "Our job is just to assess the place, see what can be salvaged, what needs to be gutted. We're not ghost hunters." That conversation felt distant now, as Michael stood in the entryway of Blackwood, breathing in the musty air that hadn't circulated properly in the 15 years since the facility had closed. The building was a massive Victorian structure, with wings sprawling out from a central administrative area. Heavy wooden doors, ornate moldings, and tall windows gave it a certain grandeur, despite the peeling paint and broken fixtures. The development company had sent over the original blueprints, yellowed and fragile with age. Michael spread them out on a folding table he'd set up in what used to be the reception area, studying the layout. The East Wing had contained patient rooms, some private for wealthy residents, others crowded dormitories for those without means. The West Wing had housed treatment rooms, a cafeteria, and recreational spaces. The basement level showed storage, maintenance, and curiously, a series of rooms labeled only as special treatment. "What do you think those were?" Jake asked, pointing to the basement rooms. Michael shrugged. "Hydrotherapy maybe, electroshock, whatever passed for psychiatric treatment back then." "Should we start down there?" "No," Michael said firmly. "We need to assess the structural integrity of the main floor first. The basement can wait." In truth, something about those basement rooms made him uneasy. He preferred to begin with the administrative wing, offices, records rooms, spaces that had contained paperwork rather than patients. Normal spaces. They spent the morning taking measurements and photographs, documenting water damage from leaky roofs, and identifying areas where the wooden floors had begun to rot. The building was in better shape than Michael had expected. Victorian buildings were constructed to last, with solid materials and craftsmanship that put modern construction to shame. "This place is built like a fortress," Jake commented as they tried to remove a damaged section of wainscoting that refused to budge. "They didn't want patients escaping," Michael replied, grunting as he finally pried the wood panel loose. Behind the wainscoting, they discovered a growth of black mold. "That's not good," Jake said, stepping back. "Should we be wearing masks?" Michael nodded, reaching into his tool bag for the respirators he'd brought along. He'd expected mold in a building that had been abandoned for so long. What he hadn't expected was the strange pattern of it, almost geometric, spreading in concentric circles like ripples in a pond. "Never seen mold grow like that," Jake muttered through his mask. "Probably something to do with the way the moisture is seeping through the wall," Michael said, though he wasn't convinced by his own explanation. They continued their work, moving from the administrative wing to the East Wing patient rooms. Many still contained metal bed frames bolted to the floors, though the mattresses had long since been removed. Windows were barred, and some rooms had padding still clinging to the walls in tatters. The rooms grew smaller and more prison-like as they moved down the hallway, from relatively comfortable private rooms to cells barely large enough for a bed. "Jesus," Jake whispered as they entered one of the smallest rooms. "Can you imagine being locked in here?" Michael ran his flashlight over the walls, revealing scratch marks in the padded material. Some appeared to form words, though they were too faded to read. Others were just frantic, desperate gouges. "Let's check the floors in here," Michael said, eager to focus on the job, rather than the building's disturbing history. "The developer wants to know if the original hardwood can be salvaged." He knelt down, pulling back a corner of the rotting rubber floor covering to reveal oak planks underneath. The wood was in surprisingly good condition, protected by the rubber overlay for decades. As he tugged more of the covering away, he noticed something unusual about the floorboards in the center of the room. "Jake, bring that light over here." Jake directed his flashlight beam where Michael was pointing. The floorboards didn't quite match. The grain pattern was different, and they were a slightly lighter color than the surrounding wood. "Looks like a repair job," Jake said. "Yeah, but why repair just this section?" Michael ran his fingers along the edge of one board, feeling for a gap. His fingernail caught on something, and he worked it into the small space. "These aren't nailed down properly." With Jake's help, he pried up the loose floorboards, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The beam of his flashlight illuminated something unexpected: a metal box, about the size of a shoebox, nestled between the floor joists. "What the hell?" Jake leaned closer. Michael reached into the cavity and pulled out the box. It was heavier than he'd expected, made of some kind of stainless steel with a simple latch on the front. The surface was covered in a fine layer of dust, but otherwise showed no signs of corrosion or damage. "Someone didn't want this found," Michael said, examining the box. The latch, though old, opened easily enough when he pressed it. Inside lay 5 leather-bound journals, their covers unmarked, except for numbers embossed on the spines: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The leather was cracked with age, but still supple. Michael lifted the first volume and opened it carefully. The handwriting inside was precise, almost mechanical in its uniformity. The first page bore only a date, March 15th, 1954, and the title Patient Observations, Project Threshold. "What is it?" Jake asked. "Some kind of research journals," Michael replied, flipping through a few pages. "Medical records, maybe. Notes about patients. Should we turn them into the developer?" Michael hesitated. The rational part of his mind said, yes, of course, these belong to the property owner now. But another part, a curious part, wanted to know what was in these journals, what Project Threshold had been. "We will," he said finally, "but let's finish the assessment first. I'll keep them safe until then." Jake seemed satisfied with this answer, and they continued their work, moving into the West Wing to document the therapy rooms and communal spaces. All the while, the metal box sat in Michael's tool bag, the journals inside calling to him with silent persistence. It was late afternoon when Jake's phone rang. Michael could tell from his assistant's expression that something was wrong. "Everything okay?" he asked when Jake ended the call. "It's my kid," school nurse called. "Looks like he broke his arm during recess. I need to go." "Go," Michael said immediately. "Family first. We've done enough for today anyway." After Jake left, Michael found himself alone in the massive building. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional groan of old timber and the faint whistle of wind through cracked windows. He should pack up and leave too, he knew, but the journals in his bag weighed on his mind. He returned to the folding table in the reception area and took out the first volume. Just a quick look, he told himself, just to see what kind of research they were doing here. The first few entries were clinical observations of patients, identified only by numbers rather than names. The author, who signed each entry only as Dr. LS, described baseline tests of cognitive function, physical health assessments, and psychological evaluations. Standard practices, though the detached tone struck Michael as unusually cold. As he read further, however, the nature of the observations began to change. April 3rd, 1954, patient 17 shows promising susceptibility to the treatment protocol. After 3 sessions, he reports visual phenomena consistent with our hypotheses, specifically perception of spaces that shouldn't be there. When asked to draw what he sees, he produced the attached sketch, see Fig. 1 of what appears to be a corridor extending from his room wall. Of note, this corridor does not exist in the facility's architecture. Patient continues to exhibit elevated heart rate and pupil dilation during episodes. Sleep disturbances have begun, with nursing staff reporting screaming at precisely 3:17 a.m. for 3 consecutive nights. Dosage will be increased by 15% for tomorrow's session. Michael frowned. Whatever treatment protocol they were using, it sounded less like therapy and more like intentionally inducing hallucinations. He turned the page, looking for the mentioned figure 1, but it was missing, perhaps removed by whoever had hidden these journals. He continued reading, finding more entries about various patients and their progress. The doctor's notes became increasingly enthusiastic as patients reported more vivid and consistent visions. Some described rooms that shifted dimensions when not directly observed. Others claimed to see figures moving through walls. One patient reportedly began speaking in a language unknown to any of the staff, which the doctor eagerly recorded in phonetic transcription. The light was fading outside, shadows lengthening across the room. Michael pulled out his phone to check the time, and was surprised to see it was already past 7 p.m. He'd been reading for nearly 3 hours. He should head home, get some dinner, continue tomorrow. But as he moved to close the journal, a particular entry caught his eye. May 27th, 1954, breakthrough with patient 23. After 6 weeks of treatment, subject was found this morning, standing facing the east wall of his room. Nurse reports he had been in this position for over 3 hours, unresponsive to verbal stimuli. When I arrived to examine him, he spoke without turning. The wall is breathing, doctor. If you watch long enough, you'll see it too. There are spaces between the atoms where something else exists. While initially skeptical, I observed the subject and the wall for approximately 30 minutes. In that time, I began to perceive a subtle undulation in the seemingly solid surface, almost imperceptible at first, but increasingly evident the longer I maintained focus. This represents our first instance of shared perception. The phenomenon is not merely subjective hallucination, but potentially objective reality becoming visible to the properly attuned observer. I have ordered patient 23's dosage doubled and initiated round-the-clock observation. A cold feeling settled in Michael's stomach. This doctor hadn't just been observing hallucinations, he'd started experiencing them himself. Whatever they were doing to these patients, it had affected the medical staff too. He forced himself to close the journal. The light was nearly gone now, and he had no desire to remain in the abandoned asylum after dark. He packed the journals back into his tool bag and gathered his equipment. As he did, a wave of dizziness passed over him. Probably low blood sugar, he thought. He hadn't eaten since the sandwich he'd had at noon. The main doors of Blackwood Hospital closed behind him with a heavy thud. In the twilight, the building loomed against the darkening sky, its many windows like blind eyes watching him leave. For the first time since taking the job, Michael felt a sense of unease about returning the next day. But the journals in his bag promised answers to questions he hadn't even formulated yet, and despite his better judgment, he knew he would be back to read more. That night, Michael dreamed of corridors, endless hallways, with doors that opened onto other hallways, a labyrinth of peeling paint and flickering lights. In the dream, he was searching for something, though he couldn't remember what. Every door he opened revealed another passageway, identical to the last. The only variation was the increasing frequency of dark stains on the floors, stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood. He woke at 3:17 a.m., drenched in sweat. Despite the cool air from his bedroom window, the time glowed red on his digital clock, and something about those specific numbers sent a shiver through him. Hadn't that been the time mentioned in the journal? The time patient 17 would scream each night. Coincidence, he told himself, just his mind incorporating what he'd read into his dreams. Sleep eluded him. After that, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying fragments of what he'd read in the journal. What exactly had Project Threshold been attempting to achieve? The entries he'd read suggested they were deliberately trying to induce specific types of hallucinations in patients, hallucinations involving impossible spaces, architectural anomalies that couldn't exist. When his alarm finally went off at 6 a.m., Michael was already in the shower, trying to wash away the lingering unease from his dream. He dressed quickly, made coffee, and found himself reaching for the tool bag where he'd stashed the journals. Just a little more reading before Jake arrived to pick him up. He opened to where he'd left off and continued reading Dr. L.S.'s accounts. June 2nd, 1954, patients 17, 23, and 29 now exhibit consistent responses to the protocol. All three independently described the same phenomenon: walls that breathe, floors that seem to recede downward when not directly observed, and most significantly, glimpses of what patient 23 calls the underneath. When pressed to elaborate on the underneath, all three subjects become agitated. Patient 17 scratched his own face until restrained, repeating only, "It sees you when you see it." Patient 29 has begun writing the same phrase repeatedly on any available surface. Most promising is patient 23, who remains articulate despite increasing episodes. He describes the underneath as the space between spaces where something is waiting to come through. When asked what this something might be, he responded, "Parts of it already have. They're in us now. That's how we can see the truth of the architecture. I must consider the possibility that these are not hallucinations, but genuine perceptions of reality, normally filtered out by the conscious mind. The treatment may be stripping away these filters, allowing patients to perceive aspects of existence previously hidden." Dr. Matthews insists, "We are inducing shared delusions, nothing more." He fails to explain how patients isolated from one another describe identical phenomena in identical language. His skepticism is becoming an impediment to our work. Michael checked his watch. Jake would be arriving in 20 minutes. He should stop reading, pack up, get ready to leave. Instead, he turned the page. June 10th, 1954. I have begun self-administration of the protocol in controlled doses. The board would not approve, of course, but as primary investigator, I cannot ignore the possibility that direct experience may yield insights impossible to obtain through observation alone. Initial effects are subtle: a slight wavering of peripheral vision, enhanced awareness of architectural spaces. Most notable is the persistent sensation that angles which appear 90 degrees are, when measured with instruments, slightly more or less. This discrepancy suggests physical space itself may be subject to manipulation by perception. Dr. Matthews discovered my self-experimentation and has threatened to report me. I have confined him to the East Wing for observation. His increasingly erratic behavior suggests he may be experiencing spontaneous effects merely from proximity to our subjects. If so, this represents an unprecedented development, contagion of perception. The doctor had started experimenting on himself and confined another doctor who objected. Michael's unease deepened. Whatever project Threshold had been, it had clearly spiraled out of control. The sound of a car horn outside pulled him away from the journal. Jake had arrived. Michael quickly returned the journal to his bag, grabbed his coffee, and headed out the door. Throughout the drive to Blackwood, he found himself unusually quiet, his mind still in those journal pages, rather than preparing for the day's work. "You okay, Mike?" Jake asked as they pulled up to the asylum. "You seem out of it." "Didn't sleep well," Michael replied, which wasn't untrue. "Let's get started on the West Wing today. We need to document the condition of those therapy rooms." The building seemed different in the morning light, less ominous, more decrepit, just an old structure falling into disrepair. Michael tried to focus on the technical aspects of the job, measuring rooms, assessing damage, making notes for the restoration plan, but his mind kept drifting back to the journals, to the patients who saw breathing walls and impossible spaces. At lunch break, Jake went out to grab sandwiches from a deli in town, leaving Michael alone in the building again. Almost without conscious decision, he found himself back at the table with the first journal open before him. He skimmed through more entries documenting the patient's deteriorating conditions. Patient 17 had started removing his own teeth, claiming they were listening. Patient 29 had gone catatonic, responding only when the doctor whispered a particular phrase in his ear, a phrase written in the journal in what appeared to be cipher rather than English. Most disturbing was patient 23, whose coherent descriptions had given way to increasingly abstract drawings of architectural spaces that seemed to fold in on themselves like optical illusions. Michael reached the end of the first journal and opened the second. The entries continued chronologically, but the doctor's tone had changed subtly. The clinical detachment was giving way to something like religious fervor. July 17th, 1954. My own experiences with the protocol have deepened considerably. I no longer require the injections to perceive the fluctuations in spatial reality. They are constant now, a background awareness, like the beating of one's heart. Most significant is the breakthrough I experienced last night. After studying patient 23's drawings for several hours, I began to understand the underlying mathematics of what he was attempting to represent. These are not random hallucinations, but consistent glimpses of a geometric reality that exists perpendicular to our familiar dimensions. At precisely 3:17 a.m., I observed my office wall begin to recede, revealing a corridor that cannot exist within the building's layout. I followed this corridor for what seemed like hours, though when I returned to my office, only minutes had passed. What I found in that impossible space confirms everything we've been working toward. There is another reality interlaced with ours, separated only by the thinnest of membranes, a membrane that our protocol is successfully perforating. Dr. Matthews was partially correct. What our patients perceive is indeed underneath the visible world, but it is no delusion. It is a stratum of reality that has always existed alongside our own, accessible only to those who know how to see. The journal entries were becoming increasingly unhinged. This doctor hadn't just been conducting research. He'd convinced himself he was discovering some kind of parallel dimension. Michael should stop reading. He knew. Call the developers, tell them about the journals, let them decide what to do with this disturbing historical record. But something compelled him to continue, a need to understand what had happened in this building, what had happened to the patients who had been subjected to these protocols. He turned the page and found what appeared to be architectural drawings, not the original blueprints of Blackwood, but alterations showing additional rooms, corridors, and spaces that couldn't possibly fit within the building's actual dimensions. Notes in the margins referred to weak points and threshold apertures, places where the membrane was thinnest. One location was circled repeatedly, a section of the basement directly beneath the room where Michael had found the journals. The sound of the main doors opening announced Jake's return. Michael quickly closed the journal and replaced it in his bag, trying to compose himself before his assistant returned. Got your usual, Jake said, handing him a wrapped sandwich. Turkey on wheat, no mayo. Thanks, Michael said, accepting the sandwich though he found his appetite had vanished. Listen, Jake, I've been thinking we should check out the basement this afternoon. According to the blueprints, there's extensive damage we need to document down there. Jake shrugged. Whatever you think is best. Those special treatment rooms you were avoiding yesterday. Michael nodded, ignoring the knowing look in Jake's eyes. We need to be thorough. The developers are paying us to assess every inch of this place. After lunch, they located the main stairwell leading to the basement. The air grew noticeably cooler as they descended, and the smell of mildew intensified. The basement level was largely unfinished, with concrete floors and exposed pipes running along the ceiling. Hallways branched off from the main area, leading to storage rooms, a massive boiler room, and the mysterious special treatment section. The hallway leading to these rooms was different from the rest of the basement, finished with the same wainscoting found upstairs, the floors laid with the same oak planks. Unlike the neglected state of the rest of the building, this hallway seemed almost preserved, as if time had somehow moved differently here. Weird that they'd make a basement hallway this nice, Jake commented, shining his flashlight along the walls. Maybe they brought important visitors down here, Michael suggested, though even as he said it, he knew it made little sense. Why bring visitors to a basement treatment area? The special treatment rooms were arranged in a circular pattern around a central hub, like spokes on a wheel. Each doorway was made of heavy metal rather than wood, with small observation windows and serious locking mechanisms. Jesus, Jake whispered. These aren't treatment rooms, they're cells. Michael said nothing, consulting the building blueprints he'd brought along. According to the doctor's altered drawings in the journal, the central hub of this wheel design was significant, a primary threshold aperture, but on the original blueprints, this central space was unmarked. They found the entrance to this central area, a double metal door with an unusual locking mechanism, requiring 2 keys to be turned simultaneously. The lock was old but appeared well maintained, unlike the rusted hardware elsewhere in the building. No way we're getting in there without the keys, Jake said, testing the solidity of the doors. Michael nodded absently, his attention caught by something odd about the doors. Unlike every other door in the facility, which swung inward to open, these doors had hinges positioned to swing outward, as if designed to contain pressure from within, rather than keep people out. They spent the next hour documenting the special treatment rooms that were accessible. Each contained what appeared to be a modified hospital bed, with restraint systems far more elaborate than would be necessary for typical psychiatric patients. The walls were lined with lead sheeting beneath the plaster. Some rooms contained equipment that neither Michael nor Jake could identify, machines with dials, and attachments that seemed designed for connection to a human body, but for what purpose, they couldn't guess. I don't like this place, Mike, Jake said as they finished examining the last accessible room. Whatever they did down here, it wasn't medical treatment. No, Michael agreed quietly. It wasn't. As they prepared to leave the basement, Michael noticed something he'd overlooked before, a section of floorboards near the central hub that appeared newer than the rest, similar to what he'd found in the patient room upstairs. Another hidden compartment. Jake, help me with this section of flooring, he said, kneeling down to examine it more closely. Together they pried up the boards, revealing another cavity beneath. Instead of a metal box, however, this space contained glass vials nestled in a rotting wooden case. Each vial contained a cloudy liquid, the glass sealed with wax. Labels had been affixed to each, but time and moisture had rendered most illegible. One, however, was still readable. Threshold serum, batch 7, refined. What the hell is that? Jake asked, keeping his distance. I don't know, Michael replied, though the journals had given him an idea. This must be the protocol the doctor had mentioned, some kind of drug they'd administered to patients, and eventually to himself. We should leave that alone, Jake said. Could be toxic, radioactive, Who knows what else? Michael nodded, replacing the floorboards carefully. You're right. We'll include it in our report to the developers. Let them deal with proper disposal. But even as he said it, Michael slipped one of the vials into his pocket. He told himself it was for documentation purposes, evidence of what had happened here. The truth was more complex, driven by a curiosity he couldn't explain even to himself. They finished their work for the day shortly after 5 p.m. Jake had a family dinner to attend, so Michael assured him he would lock up. Once again, he found himself alone in the massive building as evening approached. Instead of leaving, he returned to the reception area, opened the second journal, and continued reading. The entries grew increasingly disturbing. August 28, 1954, patient 23 is gone. Not deceased, gone. Nursing staff reported his room empty this morning, though the door remained locked from the outside. Initial assumption of escape proved impossible upon examination of the room. The windows are barred and intact, the ventilation ducts too small for human passage. I know what has happened. He has crossed the threshold completely. My own experiments with the serum have allowed me glimpses of the other side, but always I return. Patient 23 has not returned. He has been accepted by what exists in the spaces between spaces. The staff is uneasy. Reports of strange sounds emanating from the walls have increased. 3 nurses have requested transfers. Dr. Matthews remains in confinement, though his condition has deteriorated significantly. He speaks now only in mathematical equations, writing complex formulae on his walls in his own excrement. I believe he is attempting to calculate the geometric properties of the threshold. The board has sent notice of an inspection next month. Our window of opportunity narrows. I must accelerate the project. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's poor insulation. A patient had vanished from a locked room, and this doctor's response hadn't been shock or concern, but a kind of twisted validation. He'd believed the patient had crossed into another dimension. The light outside was fading rapidly now. Michael knew he should leave, return home, perhaps contact the authorities about what he'd found. Instead, he turned to the third journal. The handwriting had changed noticeably, still precise, but now cramped, the letters pressing into each other, as if the writer couldn't get the words out fast enough. Many entries were accompanied by drawings, architectural sketches showing impossible geometries, rooms that folded into themselves, staircases that looped in Mobius strip configurations. September 15, 1954. They have begun to come through, not merely perceptions now, but physical manifestations. The threshold in the basement hub has thinned to the point of translucency. Through it we can sometimes glimpse what waits on the other side. Patient 29 began screaming at 3:17 this morning, not in fear, but ecstasy. When orderlies reached his room, they found him speaking fluently in multiple languages he has no training in, including several that linguistic experts cannot identify. His body temperature has dropped to 93.4 degrees, yet he shows no signs of hypothermia. Most remarkably, his physical form has begun to exhibit subtle alterations. X-rays reveal additional structures forming within his chest cavity, structures that resemble neither human nor any known animal anatomy. He reports no pain from these changes, but rather a sense of becoming complete. I believe the entities from beyond the threshold are not merely observing us, but selecting candidates for transformation. We are being invited to evolve beyond our current biological limitations. Dr. Matthews was found dead this morning, though dead may not be the accurate term. His body remains animate, despite showing no vital signs. It moves about his room in patterns that correspond to the equations he wrote on his walls. I have ordered him moved to the central hub for closer observation. Michael closed the journal, his hands shaking. This wasn't research. It was madness. Whatever Dr. Ellis had been giving these patients, it had driven him insane as well. There were no entities, no other dimensions, just the deteriorating mind of a doctor who had experimented on vulnerable patients, and then himself. Yet as he sat in the growing darkness of the asylum, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that something about the building had changed since he'd started reading these journals. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners of the room somehow wrong, as if the right angles weren't quite 90 degrees anymore. He packed up his things quickly, suddenly eager to be anywhere but Blackwood Hospital. As he walked through the main hall toward the exit, he could have sworn he heard a whisper coming from the walls, a sound like paper being crumpled, or perhaps like something breathing. Just old pipes, he told himself, just the wind finding its way through broken windows, just the rational explanations he'd always believed in. But as he pulled the main doors closed behind him, the rational part of Michael's mind was fighting a losing battle against the evidence of his senses, and the growing suspicion that Dr. Ellis might not have been entirely wrong. That night, Michael dreamed of patient 23. In the dream, he was standing in the central hub of the basement, facing the locked double doors. From behind them came a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on metal. When he leaned closer, a voice whispered through the seam between the doors. "The walls breathe when you're not looking," it said in a conversational tone. "The floors descend when you turn away. Want to see?" In the dream, Michael found himself nodding. The doors began to swing outward, revealing not a room, but a vast, impossible space, a cathedral-like structure with dimensions that shifted and warped even as he tried to comprehend them. Standing in the center was a figure that might once have been human, but now consisted of angles and geometries that hurt his eyes to focus on. "Patient 23, Michael asked in the dream. The figure's laugh echoed with multiple harmonics, as if several voices were laughing in perfect synchronization. "No longer a patient," it said. "No longer 23. No longer contained by integers or Euclidean space." It extended what might have been an arm, inviting Michael to step through the doorway. "The doctor was right. We are the future of your form. We have been waiting for you, Michael Harmon." He woke with a gasp at precisely 3:17 a.m., his heart hammering against his ribs. The dream had been so vivid that for a moment he wasn't sure if he'd actually gone home from Blackwood or if he was still in the asylum, hallucinating in the darkness. His bedroom gradually came into focus. Familiar furniture, the glow of his digital clock, the sound of distant traffic, normal, real, except for one thing, the headache that had begun behind his eyes, a steady pressure that felt like his skull was being squeezed in a vice. He stumbled to the bathroom, fumbled for the light switch, and winced as the fluorescent glare stabbed at his retinas. In the mirror, his reflection looked ordinary enough, if tired. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes, stubble on his jaw, skin pale from too many hours spent in the dim asylum. But as he reached for the medicine cabinet, something in his peripheral vision made him freeze. For just an instant, he thought he saw movement in the wall behind him, a subtle undulation, as if the painted surface had drawn a breath. He whirled around, but the wall was just a wall, solid, motionless, exactly as it should be. Yet he couldn't shake the sensation that when he'd looked away, it had changed somehow. The headache intensified. Michael swallowed 2 aspirin and returned to bed, but sleep eluded him. His mind raced with fragments from the journals, from his dream, from the disturbing history of Blackwood Hospital. When his alarm clock finally showed 6 a.m., he gave up and got ready for work. Jake noticed something was wrong as soon as he picked Michael up. "You look like hell, Mike," he said as Michael slid into the passenger seat. "Maybe you should take the day off." "I'm fine," Michael insisted, though the headache had only worsened. "Just need some coffee." Jake studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "If you say so. But seriously, this job isn't worth making yourself sick over." If only he knew, Michael thought. If only it were as simple as overwork. At Blackwood, They focused on finishing the assessment of the first floor. Michael tried to concentrate on the task at hand, measuring rooms, documenting damage, taking photographs, but his mind kept drifting. The headache throbbed behind his eyes, and occasionally, when he wasn't looking directly at them, the walls seemed to waver slightly in his peripheral vision. During lunch break, Jake went to make a phone call outside where the reception was better, and Michael found himself drawn once more to the journals. He opened the third volume and continued reading, unable to resist despite the growing unease in his gut. September 30th, 1954. The board inspection has been delayed due to unexplained illness among the review committee. This grants us precious additional time. The threshold phenomena have accelerated beyond my most optimistic projections. Patients 17, 29, and 31 now exhibit advanced transformative symptoms. Their skeletal structures have begun to realign according to non-Euclidean geometries. X-rays reveal bones curving in directions that should be mathematically impossible. Patient 31's right arm now contains 3 distinct elbow joints, allowing movement in dimensions perpendicular to our normal 3. Most significantly, the physical changes appear to be conferring new abilities. Patient 17 was observed passing his hand directly through a solid wall yesterday, as if the barrier between solid matter had temporarily dissolved. Patient 29 communicated telepathically with nursing staff, answering questions before they were verbalized. These are not side effects of the serum but the intended outcome, the evolutionary leap we have been working toward. The entities beyond the threshold are not invaders, but teachers, showing us how to transcend our limited existence. I have increased my own dosage accordingly. The physical symptoms have begun to manifest. Slight alterations in my peripheral skeletal structure, enhanced sensory perception, and most notably, the ability to occasionally glimpse what lies beyond normal perception. The central hub in the basement has become the focal point of these phenomena. The space within appears larger than physically possible given the building's dimensions. Measurements taken yesterday indicate the room is expanding internally while maintaining its external proportions, a pocket of space that defies conventional physics. Michael's headache spiked as he read, the words swimming on the page. He closed the journal and pressed his hands against his temples, trying to alleviate the pressure. What if there had been something toxic in those journals? Old paper, mold spores, chemical residue from whatever experiments they'd been conducting. Or worse, what if just reading about these phenomena was somehow inducing similar symptoms in him? The power of suggestion could be remarkably strong. Medical students often developed phantom symptoms of diseases they studied. Perhaps reading about the patient's experiences was causing his mind to manufacture similar perceptions. Jake returned, and they continued their work. By mid-afternoon, Michael's condition had deteriorated noticeably. The headache had intensified to migraine levels, accompanied by waves of dizziness and occasional visual distortions, straight lines that seemed to curve when he wasn't focusing directly on them, shadows that moved independently of their sources. Mike, seriously, you need to go home, Jake insisted after Michael nearly fell while measuring a doorway. You're sick. This job can wait a day. Michael wanted to protest, but found he lacked the energy. Maybe you're right, he conceded. Can you drive me? I don't think I should be behind the wheel. Jake nodded, visibly relieved. Of course, let me grab our stuff. As Jake gathered their equipment, Michael found himself drawn to the staircase leading to the basement, the central hub, the place where, according to Dr. LS, the threshold was thinnest. He needed to see it again, needed to prove to himself that it was just an ordinary room, that the journals were nothing but the ravings of a delusional mind. Jake, he called out, I just need to check one thing in the basement before we go. Won't take a minute. Before his assistant could object, Michael was heading down the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the concrete stairwell. The basement was darker than he remembered. The weak afternoon light, barely penetrating the few small windows set high in the walls. He made his way to the circular arrangement of special treatment rooms, toward the central hub with its double metal doors. The lock that had stopped them before seemed different now. The mechanism appeared worn, the metal around it distorted as if subjected to extreme heat or pressure. Michael placed his hand on the door, and immediately recoiled. The metal was cold, unnaturally cold, like touching dry ice. Yet somehow it also seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, as if synchronized with a heartbeat. "Mike, where are you?" Jake's voice echoed from the stairwell. Michael stepped back from the doors, suddenly unsure of what he was doing, or why he had come down here. The migraine was making it difficult to think clearly. He turned to leave just as Jake appeared at the end of the hallway. "There you are," Jake said, relief evident in his voice. "Come on, let's get you home." As they walked away, Michael could have sworn he heard a faint tapping from behind the metal doors. Tap, 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 like fingers drumming impatiently. Jake drove him home and insisted on helping him inside. Michael assured him he would be fine, just needed some rest. Once alone, he collapsed onto his couch, the room spinning around him. The migraine had reached excruciating levels, each pulse of pain corresponding to the rhythm of his heartbeat. Despite his condition, or perhaps because of it, Michael found himself reaching for his tool bag, extracting the journals he'd brought home, the 4th volume. He needed to know how it ended, what had happened to Dr. L.S. and his patients. Through the haze of pain, he began to read. October 15th, 1954. They are coming through now with increasing frequency. The entities manifest primarily in the central hub, but their influence extends throughout the building. Patients report seeing them even in the upper floors, shadows moving independently, brief materializations in reflective surfaces, voices from inside the walls. My own transformation accelerates. The pain is considerable but necessary. The breaking down of biological limitations, the reconstruction according to superior geometries. My colleagues look at me with fear now. They do not understand that what appears to them as deformity is actually transcendence. 3 more patients have disappeared from locked rooms. They have not disappeared at all. They have crossed over. Soon I will join them. The physical alterations have progressed to the point where conventional 3-dimensional space can no longer fully contain my form. I have sealed the central hub. Only I may enter now. The entities have made it clear that not all human vessels are suitable for transformation. Those who are unprepared or resistant experience the process as a destruction rather than an evolution. The results can be messy. Dr. Matthews' animated corpse continues to move according to mathematical patterns. Yesterday it began to phase partially through the floor, confirming my theories about matter permeability. I have instructed staff to avoid the basement level entirely. What they cannot understand, they fear, and fear leads to interference. Michael forced himself to keep reading despite the pain. The entries grew more fragmented, the handwriting increasingly distorted. Pages were filled with equations and architectural drawings showing impossible geometries, rooms that existed inside themselves, corridors that looped back to their starting points, while somehow covering distance, staircases that descended infinitely without ever reaching a bottom. He was nearly at the end of the 4th journal when a wave of nausea overtook him. He barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting violently. As he knelt on the cold tile floor, heaving until there was nothing left in his stomach, he caught sight of something disturbing in the mirror above the sink. For just a moment, his reflection didn't match his movements exactly. There was a delay, as if the reflection was deciding whether to follow his lead, and behind his reflected image, the bathroom wall seemed to recede impossibly, showing a darkness beyond that couldn't exist within the actual dimensions of his apartment. Michael closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the toilet to steady himself. "It's not real," he whispered. "It's the migraine. It's suggestion from those damn journals. It's not real." When he opened his eyes and looked at the mirror again, everything appeared normal. His reflection moved when he moved, and the wall behind it was just a wall, solid and unremarkable. Still, he avoided looking at it directly as he washed his face and returned to the living room. He should stop reading, he knew. Call a doctor, get checked for potential toxic exposure. The logical part of his brain was screaming these instructions at him, but his hands moved of their own accord, opening the fifth and final journal. The early entries were nearly illegible, the writing erratic and pressed so deeply into the paper that it sometimes tore through. Entire pages were filled with the same phrase repeated hundreds of times: "The threshold thins." Other pages contained only drawings, human figures distorted into impossible anatomies, limbs bending at non-existent joints, ribcages opened like doors to reveal not organs, but vast interior spaces that couldn't possibly fit within a human body. Michael forced himself to continue, driven by a compulsion he couldn't explain. Near the end of the journal, the writing became suddenly clear again, the hand steady and controlled, though the content remained disturbing. November 7th, 1954. The board will arrive tomorrow. They cannot be allowed to see what we have accomplished. They would not understand. They would try to close the threshold, sever the connection we have worked so diligently to establish. I have made preparations. The central hub is now stable, a permanent aperture between realities. Those of us who have been chosen will cross over tonight. The others must remain behind to protect the threshold. I leave these journals as a record and a guide. Someday, others will come who are ready to see beyond the veil of conventional reality. They will find these words and understand what we have accomplished here. To you who are reading this, if the walls breathe when you look away, if the floors seem to recede beneath your feet, if the angles of your room no longer add up to 360 degrees, rejoice, you have been chosen. The threshold calls to you. Come to the central hub. The door will open for you now. Dr. Lionel S. Wendt. That was the final entry. The remaining pages were blank. Michael closed the journal, his hands shaking violently now. The migraine had changed character, transformed from stabbing pain to a strange pressure, as if his brain were expanding against the confines of his skull. In his peripheral vision, the walls of his apartment seemed to breathe gently, swelling and receding in a slow rhythm. What had happened the day after that final journal entry? Had Dr. Wendt and his chosen patients crossed some metaphysical threshold, or had there been a more mundane, horrific explanation for their disappearance? The official record, Michael knew, would likely be found in newspaper archives. Whatever had occurred at Blackwood in November 1954 must have made the local news, especially if a review board had been involved. He forced himself up from the couch, staggered to his desk, and opened his laptop. The screen seemed to warp slightly as he typed, the letters swimming before his eyes. He searched for Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital plus 1954 inches plus incident, and waited as the results loaded. The first link was to a digitized newspaper article from the Millfield Gazette, dated November 9, 1954. The headline read, "Tragedy at Blackwood, 7 dead in asylum fire." Michael clicked the link, his heart pounding. The article described a fire that had broken out in the basement of Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital on the night of November 7, 1954. 3 patients and 4 staff members, including the hospital's research director, Dr. Lionel Wendt, had perished in the blaze. The fire had been contained to the basement level, specifically a section used for specialized therapeutic treatment. The article went on to mention that a review board had been scheduled to inspect the facility the following day due to concerns about unorthodox treatment methods and patient welfare issues raised by a former staff physician. The timing had fueled speculation about whether the fire had been deliberately set, though investigators had officially ruled it an accident caused by faulty electrical wiring. A follow-up article from 2 weeks later noted that several patients had been unaccounted for during the initial evacuation, but were later found hiding in unused sections of the building. The hospital had resumed limited operations by the end of November, though the basement level remained sealed off due to structural concerns. Michael sat back, trying to process what he'd read. A fire, 7 deaths. The convenient timing just before an inspection that might have exposed whatever Dr. Wendt had been doing. It painted a very different picture than the one suggested in the journals, not a transcendent crossing of dimensional thresholds, but a desperate attempt to cover up unethical experiments, possibly resulting in murder. Yet, as logical as this explanation was, it didn't account for what Michael was experiencing now. The walls of his apartment continued to ripple subtly when he wasn't looking directly at them. The corners of his ceiling no longer appeared to meet at right angles, and most disturbing of all, the persistent sensation that someone, or something, was watching him from just beyond his range of vision. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the vial he'd taken from the basement, the one labeled Threshold Serum. The cloudy liquid inside seemed to move with an internal current, swirling slowly, though the vial remained perfectly still in his hand. Had he been exposed somehow? Had residue from the journals transferred to his skin? Had spores or chemicals in the asylum air affected him? Or was this purely psychosomatic, his mind manufacturing symptoms to match what he'd read? Whatever the explanation, Michael knew he needed help. He reached for his phone to call Jake, or perhaps 911, but as his fingers touched the screen, the device seemed to ripple beneath his hand, its solid form momentarily liquid. He jerked back, dropping the phone, which clattered to the floor. The sound echoed strangely, reverberating, as if in a much larger space than his modest apartment. "This isn't real," Michael said aloud, pressing his hands against his temples. "This is a hallucination. I need a doctor." But even as he said it, a part of him wondered if Dr. Wendt had been right all along. What if there were aspects of reality normally filtered out by human perception? What if the symptoms he was experiencing weren't illness, but evolution, the lifting of a perceptual veil? And if that were true, what waited beyond that veil? Michael lurched to his feet, determined to get to his car, drive to the hospital, get medical help. But as he crossed his living room, the floor seemed to drop beneath him, not physically but perceptually, as if the distance to the ground had suddenly doubled. He staggered, catching himself on the wall, which felt strangely yielding beneath his fingers. A voice whispered from somewhere nearby, perhaps from the wall itself, "The threshold calls to you." Michael spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but he was alone in the apartment. Yet the sensation of presence intensified, the certainty that something was watching him, waiting for him to acknowledge it. His gaze fell on the journals, spread across his coffee table. Dr. Wendt's final entry echoed in his mind. "Come to the central hub. The door will open for you now." Was that the answer? Return to Blackwood, to the central hub, and, what? See if the doors opened for him. Discover what truly waited on the other side. The rational part of Michael's mind recognized this as madness. Yet as the walls of his apartment continued to breathe around him, as the angles of reality continued to distort in his perception, rationality seemed increasingly irrelevant. He gathered the journals and the vial into his tool bag and staggered out to his car. The night air felt thick, resistant, as if he were moving through some medium denser than atmosphere. The stars above seemed too bright, too close, arranged in configurations he'd never noticed before. As he drove toward Blackwood Hospital, The roads twisted and curved in ways that didn't match his memory. Buildings alongside the road appeared stretched or compressed, their proportions subtly wrong. Yet somehow, the road felt more direct than ever before, as if the hospital were pulling him toward it, drawing him along a straight line through curved space. Blackwood loomed against the night sky, its dark windows like blind eyes watching his approach. In the moonlight, the building seemed alive, its Victorian architecture breathing gently, expanding and contracting with a slow, patient rhythm. The main doors were still unlocked from their work earlier in the day. Michael made his way through the darkened hallways without needing his flashlight. The interior spaces were somehow illuminated by a diffuse light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a soft phosphorescence that outlined every doorway and corner. He moved with growing certainty toward the basement stairwell. Each step down felt like a descent not just through physical space, but through some other dimension entirely. By the time he reached the basement level, the concrete walls around him seemed translucent, revealing glimpses of spaces that couldn't possibly exist within the building's architecture. Vast chambers, twisting corridors, vertiginous drops into darkness. The circular arrangement of special treatment rooms appeared different now. The doors to each room stood open, revealing empty interiors that seemed to extend much farther back than the building's dimensions should allow. From within some rooms came soft sounds, a woman humming tunelessly, a man counting in a language Michael didn't recognize, the rhythmic tapping of fingers against metal. He moved toward the central hub with its double metal doors, drawn by an invisible force he couldn't resist. The locking mechanism that had stopped them earlier was gone, the metal around where it had been melted and reshaped into intricate patterns that hurt his eyes to focus on. As Michael approached, the double doors began to swing slowly outward, just as they had in his dream. The movement was silent, effortless, as if the massive metal barriers weighed nothing at all. Beyond them, instead of a room, he saw a vast, impossible space, a cathedral-like structure with dimensions that shifted and warped even as he tried to comprehend them. Standing in the center was a figure. It might once have been human, but now it consisted of angles and geometries that his mind struggled to process, limbs bent at joints that shouldn't exist. The torso opened like a door to reveal not organs, but a miniature version of the same cathedral-like space, creating a recursive image that extended to infinity. The head was the most disturbing part, features that rearranged themselves constantly, eyes that appeared and disappeared at random across the surface, a mouth that sometimes wrapped entirely around the skull. Yet somehow, Michael recognized this entity. "Dr. Wendt," he whispered. The figure's laugh echoed with multiple harmonics, as if several voices were laughing in perfect synchronization. "No longer a doctor," it said, "no longer Wendt, no longer contained by names or forms or dimensions." It extended what might have been an arm, inviting Michael to step through the doorway. "We have been waiting for you, Michael Harmon. You found our message, our invitation. You began to see. Now you must choose." "Choose," Michael echoed, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. "To remain as you are, limited, temporary, blind to the greater reality, or to become as we are, to cross the threshold, to evolve beyond the constraints of your current form." As the entity spoke, other figures became visible behind it, forms that twisted and shifted in ways that defied natural law. Some Michael thought he recognized from descriptions in the journals: Patient 23, with his multiple elbow joints; Patient 17, whose body phased partially through solid matter; others whose transformations had been documented in those meticulous entries. They had not died in any fire. They had crossed over, just as Dr. Wendt had claimed. "Why me?" Michael asked, struggling to focus on the entity before him. "The threshold calls to those who can perceive it," the being that had once been Dr. Wendt explained. Few can see the truth of reality without assistance. You found our catalyst, our invitation. It gestured to the journals in Michael's bag. You began to see. Now you must decide. Michael stood at the threshold, caught between worlds. Behind him lay the Blackwood Hospital he knew, the rational world of straight lines and right angles and logical explanations. Before him stretched something else entirely, a reality of fluid geometries and impossible spaces, of existence unconstrained by the limitations he'd always accepted as immutable. What waited beyond that threshold? Evolution or madness, transcendence or obliteration? The being extended its impossible limb again, invitation and promise in the gesture. The threshold has thinned for you, Michael Harmon. It will not remain so forever. Choose. Michael took a step forward, then another. The air at the threshold felt different, vibrating with potential, thick with probability. One more step would take him beyond, into that cathedral of warped reality, where the beings waited to welcome him, to transform him. He thought of his life, before Blackwood, solid, predictable, governed by the rules of physics and construction he'd always understood. He thought of the patients who had disappeared, their bodies transformed into these strange geometries that hurt his mind to comprehend. He thought of Dr. Went, who had crossed this threshold 70 years ago, and waited here still, existing in forms beyond human understanding. The journals in his bag seemed heavier suddenly, weighted with the knowledge they contained, knowledge not meant for human minds, perhaps, yet sought after by human curiosity. The vial of cloudy liquid pressed against his thigh in his pocket, the threshold serum, the catalyst that had started this process, that had opened Dr. Went's perception to these other realities. Michael stood poised at the edge of transformation, 1 foot in each world, and made his choice. 2 weeks later, Jake Henderson pulled up to Blackwood Psychiatric Hospital for the first time since his boss's disappearance. The police had questioned him repeatedly about the last day they'd spent here together, about Michael's strange behavior, about the journals Jake had mentioned seeing but couldn't locate afterward. The official theory was that Michael, disoriented by what was likely carbon monoxide poisoning from the building's ancient heating system, had wandered into the woods behind the asylum and gotten lost. Search parties had found no trace of him, but the dense forest offered hundreds of places where a confused man might fall and become injured, hidden from aerial surveys and search dogs. Jake didn't believe it. Something about this building had changed Michael in those final days, something more than toxic exposure could explain. The way he'd been obsessed with those journals, the strange things he'd started saying about the walls breathing and the floors descending when you turned away. The development company had assigned Jake to complete the assessment report, double pay, hazard bonus, and strict instructions to work only during daylight hours, and never alone. They'd brought in environmental specialists who had declared the building free of carbon monoxide, asbestos, and other common contaminants. Yet as Jake stepped through the main doors, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong about Blackwood, something that environmental sensors couldn't detect. He made his way methodically through the first floor, checking off items on the assessment form, measuring rooms, documenting damage. Everything seemed normal, exactly as he and Michael had left it 2 weeks ago, until he noticed the basement door standing slightly ajar. He was certain they'd closed it the last time they'd been here. The police had searched the basement thoroughly during their investigation, and would have secured it afterward. Jake approached the door cautiously. His instincts told him to ignore it, to continue his work on the main floor, to stay away from the basement with its special treatment rooms, and the mysterious central hub that had so fascinated Michael. But something drew him forward, curiosity, concern, a need to understand what had happened to his friend and mentor. The basement stairs seemed steeper than he remembered, the air at the bottom colder, and somehow dense, resistant to his movement. He made his way along the main corridor toward the circular arrangement of treatment rooms, his flashlight beam dancing ahead of him. The central hub with its double metal doors stood closed, the locking mechanism intact, showing no signs of tampering. Jake approached cautiously, running his light over the surface. Something caught his attention. A piece of paper wedged into the seam between the doors. He reached out and carefully extracted it. It was a page torn from a notebook, the kind Michael always kept in his tool bag for measurements and notes. The handwriting was unmistakably his boss's, though somehow different, more precise, more deliberate, the letters connecting in ways they hadn't before. The message was brief. Jake, if you're reading this, you've come back to Blackwood. I understand why. The building calls to those who can hear it. I've found answers on the other side of these doors. I've seen what Dr. Went saw. The transformation is painful but necessary. You have a choice. I didn't fully understand when I made it. The threshold will open for you, if you truly wish it. But consider carefully. What waits beyond cannot be undone. The walls breathe when you're not looking. The floors descend when you turn away. If you've started to see it too, then you're already beginning the journey. Michael, PS 3:17 a.m. The time matters. Jake stared at the note, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. Michael had been here, had somehow gotten through these locked doors, had left this message. When? The police had searched this area thoroughly days ago and found nothing. He looked up at the imposing metal doors of the central hub for just a moment, so briefly he might have imagined it. He thought he saw them ripple slightly, as if drawing a breath. Jake took a step backward, then another, the note clutched in his trembling hand. As he retreated, a sound reached him from beyond the doors, a soft tapping, like fingers drumming on metal, and beneath that, what might have been Michael's voice, distorted by distance or by something else entirely. He turned and ran, not stopping until he reached his truck in the parking lot. His heart pounded in his chest as he fumbled with his keys, desperate to put distance between himself and Blackwood Hospital. As he drove away, he glanced in his rearview mirror at the asylum receding behind him. For just an instant, the building's proportions seemed wrong, expanded somehow, its dimensions warped in ways that defied explanation. Then it was just a building again, dark and abandoned against the afternoon sky. Jake drove straight to the police station to turn in Michael's note. They would want to search the basement again, to try once more to open those metal doors and see what lay beyond. But as he parked outside the station, he hesitated, looking down at the note in his hand. Something about the words tugged at his awareness, awakening sensations he'd been trying to ignore since entering Blackwood today. The subtle wrongness of angles that should be straight, the sense that space is expanded when not directly observed, the feeling of being watched by something that existed just at the edge of perception. Jake folded the note and put it in his pocket instead of taking it inside. Perhaps he would return to Blackwood tonight, alone. Perhaps he would see what waited beyond those metal doors. Perhaps at 3:17 a.m., the threshold would open for him too. The end.